Picture this. It is July. The year is 1212. The sun over southern Spain is not warm. It is punishing. It hammers down on a landscape of cracked earth and dry scrub, on limestone ridges that shimmer in the heat like the surface of something alive. You are standing at the edge of a mountain pass somewhere in the Sierra Morena, and the air smells like dust and sweat and horse dung and iron. Around you, thousands of men. Tens of thousands of men. Knights in full mail, their surcoats stained with road grime, their horses foaming at the mouth from a march that has taken days. Foot soldiers carrying spears and shields worn to splinters. Monks walking alongside mercenaries. Men speaking Castilian, Aragonese, Navarrese, Portuguese, French, German. A coalition of the desperate, the faithful, and the furious, for all converging on a single point in the geography of history. And ahead of you, through that pass, on the other side of those mountains, is an army so large that when scouts first caught sight of it, hardened veterans, men who had been to war a dozen times, went pale and quietly asked if someone should start confessing. We're talking about the Almohad Caliphate, the most powerful Islamic empire in the Western world. An army that had already destroyed a Christian force on this exact soil just 14 years earlier, leaving an entire generation of Iberian knights dead in the dirt. An army commanded by Muhammad al-Nasir, a man who had spent years preparing for this moment, who had built fortifications, assembled forces, and waited for the Christians to be stupid enough to come to him. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. The Christians came anyway. Why? What made them march into those mountains in the worst heat of summer, outnumbered, exhausted, fractured by rivalry and religious politics, against an enemy that had already proven it could destroy them? What possible combination of desperation, faith, and strategic genius could make a force like that not only survive, but win? And not just win a battle, but win in a way that changed the entire arc of Western civilization? That is what this video is about. And I want you to stay with me for every single minute of it. Because by the end, you're not just going to understand one battle. You're going to understand how the modern map of Europe was drawn in blood on a single July morning in the mountains of Andalusia. You're going to understand what it means to be backed into a corner, to have no option left but to fight, and to reach down into something deeper than courage and find out what you're actually made of. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We do deep dive history on this channel, not textbook summaries, not Wikipedia recitations. We live inside these moments. And if you're watching this from somewhere in Spain, or Portugal, or Morocco, or anywhere in Europe, drop it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, because this story belongs to all of us. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let me be blunt with you. Las Navas de Tolosa is not just a medieval battle. It is not just a footnote in a history textbook between two dates you have to memorize for an exam. It is the battle that determined whether Christianity or Islam would dominate the Iberian Peninsula, and by extension, whether Western Europe as we know it would exist at all. Think about that for a moment. The Iberian Peninsula had been, for 5 centuries, a contested ground. Muslims had crossed from North Africa in 711 and swept across almost the entire landmass in under a decade. The Almohad Caliphate turned Cordoba into one of the most sophisticated cities on earth, a place of libraries, running water, philosophy, science, while the rest of Europe was still struggling to keep candles lit in the dark. This was not a world of simple savagery and barbarism on either side. This was a world of competing empires, each convinced that God, history, and momentum were on their side. The Reconquista, The Christian effort to reconquer the peninsula had been grinding forward for 400 years. 400 years of battles, truces, betrayals, marriages, alliances, and colossal reversals. And by 1212, after centuries of effort, after generations of sacrifice, it had reached a tipping point. The Christian kingdoms of Iberia had been making slow, grinding progress. But one catastrophic defeat, one broken alliance, one lost battle at the wrong moment, and that progress could be erased. The Almohad Caliphate had already proven that once. At the Battle of Alarcos in 1195, the Almohads had shattered the army of King Alfonso VIII of Castile. Not just defeated it, shattered it. Killed thousands of knights, captured fortresses, pushed the Christian frontier back significantly. Now Alfonso, the man who would eventually command the Christian coalition at Las Navas, had watched his army destroyed, his kingdom humiliated, his reputation in ruins. For 14 years he had lived with that defeat. For 14 years he had been rebuilding, regrouping, planning. And in 1212 he called in every favor, forged every alliance, and made his move. If he failed, the momentum of the Reconquista would be broken, possibly permanently. The Almohad Caliphate, already the most powerful force in the Western Mediterranean, would be emboldened to push north. France itself might have been threatened. The history of Europe, the nations, the languages, the cultures, the borders, everything we think of as the West, hung on what happened in a mountain pass in Andalusia on July 16th, 1212. No pressure. So to understand why this battle happened, you have to understand the world that made it inevitable. And that world is messy, complicated, and full of the kind of human failure that makes historians simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Go back to the year 711. Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general commanding a Muslim army, crosses the Strait of Gibraltar with about 7,000 men. He lands on the rock that will forever bear his name, Jabal Tariq. Gibraltar. Within 3 years, the Visigoths, the Christian Germanic people who had ruled the Iberian Peninsula since the collapse of Rome, are essentially finished. Their kingdom collapses with astonishing speed, a victim of internal divisions, treacherous nobles, and a military that was simply not equipped to deal with what hit them. By 720, Muslim forces control almost all of Iberia, and they are pushing into France. It takes a Frankish general named Charles Martel, hammering them back at the Battle of Tours in 732, to stop the advance north of the Pyrenees. But south of the mountains, the Muslims are there to stay. The remarkable thing is what they built. Al-Andalus, the Muslim-controlled regions of Iberia, becomes one of the most culturally sophisticated places in the early medieval world. Córdoba under the Umayyads becomes a city of 500,000 people at a time, when Paris has maybe 30,000. There are paved streets, public lighting, hundreds of bathhouses, dozens of libraries. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars work side by side in the same institutions, translating Greek philosophy into Arabic, preserving knowledge that the rest of Europe has forgotten. The word algebra comes from this world. The word algorithm, the surgical techniques that European physicians will eventually use for centuries. But this sophistication coexists with something darker, because empires built on conquest carry the seeds of their own fragmentation. As the Umayyad Caliphate weakens in the east, Al-Andalus fractures. By the early 11th century, the once unified caliphate has broken into dozens of small successor states called taifas, petty kingdoms ruled by local strongmen who spend as much energy fighting each other as fighting the Christians to the north. This is the opening the Christian kingdoms are waiting for. Slowly, incrementally, they push south. In 1085, King Alfonso VI of Castile captures Toledo, the ancient Visigoth capital, the symbolic heart of Iberia, and the Christian world erupts in celebration, and the momentum seems irresistible. But then the Muslims call for help. The rulers of the Taifas, threatened by Christian expansion and too proud to simply surrender, make a decision that will change everything. They invite the Almoravids, a powerful Berber dynasty from North Africa, fanatically religious, militarily formidable, to cross the strait and help defend Al-Andalus. And the Almoravids come, and they defeat Alfonso VI at the Battle of Sagrajas in 1086, rolling back Christian gains and reshuffling the entire board. Think about that. The Taifa rulers called in the Almoravids to save them from the Christians. But the Almoravids, once established in Iberia, gradually absorbed the Taifas themselves, replacing them with their own direct rule. The cure had become the disease. And when the Almoravids themselves eventually weakened, felt fractured by internal tensions and a new religious reform movement, the Taifas re-emerged, only to face the same problem all over again. That new religious reform movement was the Almohads. The Almohads were not just politically powerful. They were ideologically intense in a way that the Almoravids had eventually stopped being. Founded in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco in the early 12th century by a religious reformer named Ibn Tumart, the Almohad movement preached strict monotheism, al-Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, and regarded the Almoravids and their theological compromises with contempt. Ibn Tumart declared himself the Mahdi, the divinely guided leader, and his followers conquered Morocco, then all of North Africa from Morocco to Libya, then crossed into Iberia and swept the Almoravids aside. By the late 12th century, the Almohad Caliphate controls an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the border of Egypt, and from the Sahara to the peaks of the Sierra Morena. It is the most powerful state in the Western world, and its new caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, known to Christian sources as Mir al-Mu'minin, a corruption of Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, is ambitious, organized, and absolutely certain that God has appointed him to complete the work his predecessors began. He has been watching the Christian kingdoms. He knows about the tensions between Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal. He knows about the petty disputes, the border skirmishes between Christian kings, who can't stop fighting each other long enough to present a united front. He knows that the memory of Alarcos still haunts Alfonso VIII of Castile, and he is planning. The Almohad military machine was not something you improvised a response to. It was the product of centuries of desert warfare and religious mobilization, refined into an instrument of terrifying efficiency. Let's start with the numbers. At Las Navas, contemporary sources give wildly varying figures, as they always do in medieval sources, where numbers tend to be impressive rather than accurate. Christian chroniclers report Almohad forces of 200,000, 300,000, even more. Modern historians, working from logistical analysis and more critical reading of the sources, suggest something in the range of 20,000 to 30,000 combat-effective troops, possibly more. But this still represents a force that substantially outnumbered the Christian coalition in terms of professional fighting men. And these were not ordinary soldiers. The core of the Almohad army was the Black Guard, elite sub-Saharan African infantry loyal personally to the caliph, disciplined in a way that other medieval armies simply were not. These men had been with the Almohad movement from its earliest days in Morocco. They trained constantly. They fought as a unit, not as individuals. They held formations under pressure that would cause other troops to break and scatter. Surrounding the Black Guard were layers of additional forces. Berber cavalry from the Atlas Mountains, fast and mobile, expert at the kind of hit-and-run tactics that could shred European-style cavalry charges. Andalusian volunteers, motivated by religious conviction and by genuine fear of what would happen to their communities if the Christians advanced. Amazigh tribal levies from across North Africa, and the personal household troops of the Caliph himself, armored, mounted, and equipped with the best weapons that the wealth of an empire stretching across the Mediterranean world could buy. The Almohad logistical system was also sophisticated for its era. Al-Nasir had spent months assembling supplies at the fortress of Calatrava, ensuring his army could sustain a campaign in the field. He had engineers capable of building field fortifications, men who understood how to use terrain, and a communication network, the ability to send fast riders between units and between his army and cities, that gave him situational awareness the Christian commanders would have envied. And he had position. Enormous, decisive positional advantage. The Christian forces, marching from Toledo in June 1212, had to cross the Sierra Morena, the dark mountain range that forms the natural barrier between the central Spanish plateau and the valleys of Andalusia to the south. The passes through these mountains were defensible in a way that turned armies into trickles. Al-Nasir had positioned his main force on the southern side, at the broad plateau near a place called Las Navas de Tolosa, knowing that any Christian army coming to engage him would have to come through those passes one piece at a time, exhausted and strung out, easy prey for a counterattack. He had, in other words, turned the landscape itself into a weapon. There was one pass above all others that mattered, the Puerto del Muradal, the broadest and most accessible route through the mountains. Al-Nasir fortified its southern exit with earthworks, ditches, and positioned troops to hold it. When Christian scouts probed the defenses, they came back with grim reports. The pass was blocked. The army could not get through. And after the disasters of Alarcos, after watching what happened when the Almohads got room to fight, the Christian commanders knew what getting through would mean if they tried to force it directly. They would emerge from that pass in a broken column, unable to deploy properly, their cavalry useless in the confined terrain, their infantry cut down before they could form ranks. The trap was set. Al-Nasir was waiting. And the Christian army, stranded in the heat on the wrong side of the mountains, was beginning to wonder if coming here had been a colossal mistake. Imagine standing there, in that heat, looking at those mountains, knowing what's on the other side. So knowing that the man who wiped out your king's army 14 years ago is sitting behind those peaks, watching, waiting, comfortable, and certain that you have to come to him. Let that sink in. The Christian coalition that assembled in Toledo in the early summer of 1212 was, on paper, an impressive force. In practice, it was a walking argument waiting to happen. King Alfonso VIII of Castile was the driving force behind everything. He was in his late 50s in 1212, old for a medieval king who had spent his reign fighting, and he carried the weight of Alarcos on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had been king since the age of 3, had grown up in the chaos of regency politics, had survived assassination plots and political manipulation from the time he could walk. He was not a man who gave up easily, but Alarcos had marked him in ways that went beyond military defeat. It had been a humiliation in front of his peers, a demonstration that the Almohad forces were not just dangerous, they were qualitatively superior to anything he had fielded. Rebuilding after that defeat had taken everything he had. Alfonso had secured extraordinary support for this campaign. He had traveled to Rome and won the backing of Pope Innocent III, who declared the campaign a crusade, which meant that participants received the same spiritual rewards as those who fought in the Holy Land. This brought an influx of French and other foreign volunteers, knights and foot soldiers from across the Pyrenees, drawn by the promise of salvation and the smell of holy war. King Peter II of Aragon brought his own contingent, experienced fighters, on a king who was personally brave to the point of recklessness. Peter and Alfonso had their differences. Aragonese and Castilian kings usually did, but they had agreed to set those differences aside, temporarily. King Sancho VII of Navarre rounded out the coalition. Sancho was enormous, literally. Medieval sources describe him as exceptionally tall and physically imposing, and he commanded a force of Navarrese warriors who had been fighting these same mountains their entire lives. There were also the military orders, the Knights of Santiago, the Knights of Calatrava, the Knights of the Temple, the Knights of the Hospital. These men were professionals in the truest sense. Fighting was not their occupation. It was their vocation, their identity, their reason for existing. They trained constantly, lived austere lives oriented entirely around combat readiness, and had no concept of retreat as a moral option. They were the shock troops of the Christian coalition, the men you sent first into the worst situation, because they were the ones most capable of surviving it, and least capable of being shaken by it. But the coalition almost fell apart before it even reached the mountains. The French volunteers, thousands of them, fired up by crusading fervor and the rhetoric of holy war, arrived in Toledo full of enthusiasm and absolutely no understanding of how wars were actually fought in Iberia. When the initial advance revealed not immediate battle, but slow, grinding movement through heat and difficult terrain, when the supply situation proved challenging and the pace was slower than expected, a significant portion of the French forces simply left. They turned around and went home. Some were disgusted by the treatment of Muslim civilians in towns along the route. Some were genuinely convinced the campaign was poorly led. Some were just hot and hungry and had decided that a crusade in the abstract was more appealing than a crusade in practice. Their departure stripped the coalition of thousands of men and could have been a catastrophic blow to morale. It wasn't, entirely because of who was left. The Iberian Knights, the military orders, the Castilian, Aragonese, and Navarrese troops who remained. These men were not here for crusading adventure. They were here because if this battle was lost, it was their homes, their families, their kingdoms that would pay the price. They had nowhere else to go. But the passage through the Sierra Morena remained blocked. The Puerto del Muradal was fortified and defended. A direct assault would be bloody, maybe impossible, and the army could not stay where it was indefinitely. Water was limited, food was being consumed, and the summer heat was a slow, patient enemy that took no sides. Then something happened, something that the chronicles record as a miracle, and which historians have debated ever since. A shepherd appeared. According to the most famous version of the story, a local shepherd named Martín Alhaja came to King Alfonso's camp and offered to guide the army through an alternative route, a hidden path through the mountains that the Almohad forces had not blocked, that would bring the Christian army out onto the plateau south of the peaks without having to force the defended pass. Who was this shepherd? Was he really a simple herder who happened to know the mountains? Was he a Christian spy, a double agent, someone sent deliberately to provide the information? Was he a Muslim who had reasons of his own for wanting al-Nasir's overconfidence punished? The sources disagree, embroider, mythologize. Later accounts made him a saint. The most skeptical historians suggest that local knowledge of mountain paths was simply not as mysterious as the dramatic retelling implies, that Alfonso's scouts, with enough time and determination, would have found the route regardless. What matters is this: the army moved. In the dark hours before dawn on July 15th, 1212, the Christian coalition began threading itself through the mountains by an alternative route, bypassing the defended pass, but emerging onto the open plateau to the south, where al-Nasir's main force was camped. The trap had been avoided. Now a different kind of trap needed to be set. The moment that truly ignited Las Navas de Tolosa did not happen on the battlefield. It happened 14 years earlier, in the aftermath of Alarcos, and it had been burning ever since like a coal kept alive under ash. At Alarcos, in 1195, after destroying Alfonso VIII's army, the Almohad Caliphate Yaqub al-Mansur had done something that went beyond military victory. He had taken his prisoners, stripped them of their dignity, and publicly humiliated the King of Castile in a way designed not just to defeat him, but to break him psychologically. He had his men mock the Christian dead, desecrate their military symbols, and send captured Christian standards back to Marrakesh as trophies. And he had given Alfonso the kind of defeat that was meant to be remembered as final, as a statement about the fundamental hierarchy of the world, about who was stronger, about who God favored. Alfonso had not broken, but he had never forgotten. And then there was the chain. The Almohad camp at Las Navas was surrounded by an extraordinary defense, and not just earthworks and ditches. Al-Nasir had ordered his personal guard, the elite Black Guard soldiers who formed the innermost ring of his defensive position, to chain themselves together, to literally tie themselves with iron chains around their ankles. The message was theatrical, deliberate, and psychologically loaded. These men will not retreat, cannot retreat, will die where they stand rather than give ground. It was a performance of absolute commitment, designed to terrify the enemy and electrify his own forces. It was also, in retrospect, a statement of supreme confidence that was only a half step from arrogance. Because what al-Nasir was communicating to his own troops, to the Christian forces across the field, to history itself, was that he expected to win so completely, so overwhelmingly, that the question of retreat was simply not relevant. He was not just defending a position, he was proclaiming a verdict. God has given us this land. God has given us this battle. There is nothing you can do. For the Christian commanders, studying the Almohad position on the morning of July 16th, this display cut both ways. It was terrifying, yes. The Black Guard chained to their positions meant that the innermost defensive ring could only be broken, and never bent. There would be no moment when pressure caused the center to sag and pull back. No tactical retreat that created an opportunity to exploit. If the Christians reached those chained soldiers, the fighting would be catastrophic, grinding, attritional in the worst possible way. But the chains also told them something else. Al-Nasir was not planning for contingencies. He was not thinking about what would happen if his outer lines failed, if his cavalry was driven back, if the battle did not unfold the way he had scripted it. He was thinking about a crushing, total victory. He was not thinking about survival. And for Alfonso, who had spent 14 years thinking about almost nothing else, that arrogance was the opening he had been waiting for. There is a moment, and if you've ever been in any situation where the outcome mattered enormously, you've felt something like it. When fear and resolve switch places. When the weight of everything you're afraid of somehow transmutes into fuel. Alfonso VIII had been afraid of the Almohads since Alarcos. Not afraid in a cowardly sense, but afraid in the way that a man is afraid when he genuinely understands the scale of what he's facing and respects it. That kind of fear, in the right man at the right moment, doesn't paralyze. It clarifies. On the evening of July 15th, as the Christian army came through the mountains and looked down on the Almohad positions, Alfonso held a council of war. The consensus was that the army needed rest. They had been marching hard, and that the battle should wait until morning. Alfonso agreed. But that night, the chronicles tell us, he was restless, moving through the camp, talking to his commanders, to the masters of the military orders, to his fellow kings, not giving speeches, not making proclamations, just talking, listening, making sure everyone understood what tomorrow meant. By morning, the Christian army was ready in a way that went beyond tactical preparation. They were ready in the way that people are ready when they understand that there is no next time, no second chance, no alternative plan. This was the moment. Every road they had traveled, every battle they had survived, every humiliation they had absorbed had led here. The sun came up over the Sierra Morena, and the armies of Alfonso VIII of Castile, Peter II of Aragon, and Sancho VII of Navarre looked across the plain at the greatest army in the Western world and moved forward. Let me walk you through the battlefield, because the geography of Las Navas de Tolosa is as important as anything the commanders decided. The plateau where the battle was fought is broad and relatively flat, suitable for cavalry operations in a way that the mountain passes were not. This was crucial for the Christians, whose heavy cavalry represented their most powerful offensive weapon. Medieval European knights were, pound for pound, the most devastating shock force of their era. Heavily armored men on large war horses, trained from childhood to charge in formation and hit enemy lines with concentrated impact. In the narrow terrain of mountain passes, that capability was essentially useless. On open ground, it was decisive. But the Almohad position was not simply standing on a flat field waiting to be charged. Al-Nasir had organized his forces in a layered defensive formation that modern military analysts would recognize as a version of defense in depth, multiple lines, each designed to slow, exhaust, and disorient an attacking force before it reached the core. The first line consisted of Almohad cavalry, light horsemen, fast and mobile, armed with bows and lances. Their job was not to hold ground. Their job was to harry, to disrupt, to prevent the Christian cavalry from building the momentum they needed for an effective charge. Think of them as speed bumps, not walls, but obstacles designed to make everything slower and more expensive. Behind them, Almohad infantry, experienced, disciplined, armed with shields and spears, formed the second defensive layer. These men would hold ground, absorbing the impact of charges that got through the first line and trying to bleed the Christian advance to a standstill. And at the center, behind all of it, on a slight rise from which Al-Nasir could observe the entire battle, was the Black Guard. Chained, immovable, surrounded by earthworks and a palisade of stakes driven into the ground. The last line, the heart of the position. The Christian commanders chose a formation that mirrored this structure in reverse. Mass against mass, with their most capable shock troops held at the center, where they could either reinforce weakness or exploit success. Alfonso of Castile commanded the center directly. His forces, the core Castilian cavalry and the military orders, were positioned to make the decisive push once the outer Almohad lines had been engaged. Peter of Aragon commanded the right flank. His Aragonese cavalry were given the task of pressing the Almohad left, maintaining pressure, and preventing Al-Nasir from shifting reserves to strengthen other areas. Sancho of Navarre commanded the left flank. His Navarre's forces, and here is where the most famous moment of the battle would eventually occur, were positioned opposite the Almohad right, facing the outer defensive works and the approaches to Al-Nasir's personal position. The initial Christian advance, led by the vanguard under Diego López de Haro, one of Alfonso's most trusted nobles, moved forward to engage the first Almohad line. And immediately, the battle became what all honest soldiers will tell you. Battles become within minutes of starting. The Almohad cavalry did exactly what they were supposed to do. They came forward fast, hit the advancing Christian line with missiles, probed for weaknesses, then pulled back before the heavy cavalry could close with them and use their weight advantage. It's the same tactic that had frustrated heavy cavalry for centuries: the Parthian shot, the feigned retreat. The method that says, I don't have to fight you at your best. I'll fight you at your worst, when you're tired and strung out and chasing shadows. For a time, the Christian advance stalled. The vanguard took casualties. The lines became disordered. Some of the knights, frustrated and impatient, pushed forward beyond where they should have been, creating gaps in the formation that the Almohad cavalry probed with increasing aggression. Alfonso watched this from his position in the center, and in the accounts, we catch a glimpse of him at this moment that feels entirely human. He turned to Archbishop Rodrigo of Toledo, the prelate who was both his spiritual advisor and one of the principal architects of the crusade, and said something to the effect that they would either die here together or conquer. The archbishop, who was not a fighting man but who had ridden to this battlefield in full armor because the moment demanded it, told the king that he would not die, that victory was theirs. Whether either of them believed it at that exact instant, the accounts don't say. What they do say is that Alfonso ordered the main body forward. Al-Nasir's tactical plan depended on a specific sequence of events. The Christian advance would be slowed, disordered, and bled by the cavalry screen. The infantry second line would then absorb whatever impact remained from the Christian heavy cavalry, blunting the charge, stopping the momentum, bringing the battle to close quarters fighting on ground, prepared to favor the defenders. And then, when the Christian forces were exhausted and disordered, the reserves would counterattack, and the Caliph would watch from his elevated position as the same thing that happened at Alarcos happened again. It was a good plan. It was based on accurate assumptions about the strengths and weaknesses of both forces, and it was almost working. The Christian vanguard was in serious trouble. The initial charge had not broken through the Almohad first line cleanly. The horses were tiring. The men were fighting in the brutal July heat, in full mail, and exhaustion was beginning to affect coordination and judgment. Alfonso's center was pressing forward, but progress was measured in yards, not miles, and every yard came at a price. And here is where overconfidence becomes fatal. Al-Nasir had positioned himself and his blackguard at the highest point of the Almohad formation, both for observation and for symbolic reasons, to be visible, to inspire his forces. But that visibility was a double-edged sword. Every man in the Christian army who looked up from the fighting could see the Almohad command position. They could see the black banners of the Caliph's guard. They could see the tent where Al-Nasir sat, reportedly on a throne, with the Quran open before him, with officials and bodyguards around him. The Caliph was not fighting, he was observing. And in the medieval world, the personal courage and physical presence of a commander on the battlefield was not merely symbolic, it was a critical element of tactical leadership, a way of communicating confidence and commitment to troops who needed both. The accounts tell us that as the battle developed, Al-Nasir's confidence in his defensive plan began translating into a kind of detachment. The plan was working. The Christians were being ground down. There was no need for intervention, for adjustment, for the kind of forward-leaning engagement that medieval commanders who fought in the front ranks provided to their troops as a constant, visible reminder of what was at stake. He was watching a victory unfold, or he thought he was. What he was actually watching was the moment immediately before everything changed, because while the battle in the center was grinding, brutal, and inconclusive, something was happening on the Christian left flank. Sancho of Navarre, the enormous king who had come to this battle with something personal at stake, was examining the Almohad right, the outer defensive works, the earthworks and stakes, the fortified approaches to Al-Nasir's position. And he saw something. A gap. Not a large gap, not an obvious one. A place where the defensive works were not quite as solid as they looked, where the terrain created a fold in the ground that channeled movement, where a fast, hard, committed charge might be able to punch through before the defenders fully responded. Sancho made his decision. He turned to his knights, the Navarrese cavalry, men who had ridden with him for years, to men who trusted his judgment, and he told them what he was going to do. Then he charged. The charge of Sancho of Navarre through the outer Almohad defenses on the morning of July 16th, 1212, is one of the most celebrated cavalry actions in medieval history. And watching it described in the chronicles, in the accounts of men who were there, you can feel something that history only rarely delivers. The moment when everything pivots, when the entire weight of a conflict suddenly shifts, when an outcome that seemed written begins to be rewritten in real time. Sancho doesn't go alone. He goes with his household cavalry, his best men, the ones who've trained and fought alongside him, who understand how he thinks and what he expects. They punch through the gap in the outer earthworks before the Almohad defenders fully register what's happening. The defenders respond. Of course they do. But the response is fractured, disorganized, because this attack is coming from an unexpected direction at an unexpected moment, and the Almohad outer line troops, who have been focused on the grinding battle in the center, suddenly have cavalry in among them. The Black Guard sees them coming. The chained soldiers brace. But here is what the chains actually mean in this moment, and why al-Nasir's theatrical gesture of supreme confidence is also his greatest tactical mistake. The Black Guard cannot maneuver. They can fight where they stand, and they will fight to the death, and they are terrifying. But they cannot respond to a threat from a direction they weren't expecting. They cannot shift, cannot redeploy, cannot move to create a defensive angle that addresses the specific line of attack that Sancho has found. The chains that were supposed to demonstrate their resolution have turned them into an obstacle. A formidable obstacle, yes, but an obstacle nonetheless, rather than a responsive defensive force. Sancho drives through them. The accounts of this moment in the Christian chronicles are almost euphoric in their violence. The Navarrese knights crash into the Black Guard with every ounce of momentum Sancho's charge has built. Men fight at the distances, where armor doesn't help as much as pure animal ferocity. Swords, maces, the pommel of a lance used as a bludgeon when there's no room to swing, horses rearing and kicking, men on the ground dying under hooves, the sound of chains under the feet of charging war horses. And then Sancho reaches the tent, the Almohad command post, the Caliph's position, the place where al-Nasir sat with his Quran and his officials, and his certainty that God had already decided this outcome. Al-Nasir is gone. He has fled. The accounts say he left on a mule. There's something almost grimly comic about it. The contrast between the theatrical magnificence of the chained Black Guard and their supreme commander escaping on a mule, and retreated south with a small guard as the battle collapsed around him. What he left behind, his tent, his throne, his personal standard, the great ornamental chain that had decorated the entrance to his command area, was captured. The Christian knights took that chain. According to tradition, Sancho of Navarre incorporated a broken chain into the arms of his kingdom, because he had broken the chains of the Almohad defense, both literally and symbolically. You can see those chains in the coat of arms of Navarre to this day. 8 centuries later, they're still there. Think about that. When the Caliph's standard fell, when the command position was overrun, the effect on the Almohad army was instantaneous and catastrophic. Not because the loss of a tent or a symbol physically changes the battlefield. It doesn't. But because in a medieval army, especially one that has been told that God himself is on its side and that its commander is the vessel of divine will, the sight of that commander's position overrun, his standard fallen, his personal guard dead or scattered. This is not just bad news. It is a revelation that the story they have been told about this battle is wrong. The certainty dissolves. The conviction that God has ordained their victory becomes, in a single, shattering instant, a question mark. And armies cannot fight well when they are asking themselves questions. The Almohad lines begin to break. Not everywhere at once. Some units hold. Some fight and die where they stood, because they have no choice, and because there are always men in every army who don't run, regardless of what's happening around them. But the overall structure of the Almohad defense, which depended on cohesion, on every unit holding its position, on reserves being available to address threats, has been broken at its heart. Alfonso's Castilian cavalry, watching from the center as the Almohad right flank collapsed, it drives forward with everything they have left. Peter of Aragon's Aragonese press on the other flank. The military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, the Templars, the Hospitallers, pour through every gap, every break in the line, pushing the disorganized Almohad forces back toward the south. The pursuit is savage. Medieval battles kill most of their dead in the pursuit, not in the main engagement, because once a formation breaks and men start running, they are enormously vulnerable. They are no longer a coordinated force. They are individuals trying to cover ground as fast as they can, in heavy equipment, while mounted opponents who are not running catch them from behind. The accounts of Las Navas speak of miles of ground covered in Almohad dead, of abandoned equipment and weapons stretching south across the plateau, of the complete disintegration of an army that had been, that morning, the most powerful military force in the Western Mediterranean. Al-Nasir reached Jaén, then Marrakesh. The battle was over. Short sentences, because the end came that fast. The army broke. The chain fell. The caliph fled. The day belonged to Castile. The morning after Navas de Tolosa, the Christian commanders stood on a field thick with the dead and tried to understand what had just happened. They had won. That was certain. But the scale of the victory, the completeness of it, the way the most powerful army in the Western Mediterranean had not just been defeated, but effectively destroyed as a coherent force. This was something none of them had fully expected. They had come hoping to survive, hoping to hold, hoping to deal a blow that would slow the Almohad advance and buy their kingdoms another generation of breathing room. What they had achieved was categorically different. The immediate military consequences were dramatic. In the months following Las Navas, the Christian kingdoms advanced rapidly south. Calatrava, Ubeda, Baeza, cities and fortresses that had seemed beyond reach, fell in rapid succession. The Almohad defensive system in Iberia, built around the assumption that the Almohads could project overwhelming force from their North African heartland whenever needed, was exposed as hollow. Al-Nasir himself never recovered, psychologically or politically. He died in 1213, less than a year after the battle, and the succession crisis that followed plunged the Almohad Caliphate into the same pattern of fragmentation that had destroyed the Almoravids before them. The taifas re-emerged, the caliphate fractured. North Africa went one way, Iberia went another, and the unified military-political entity that had made Las Navas seem like such an overwhelming challenge ceased to exist within a generation. This is what historians mean when they talk about Las Navas as a tipping point, not just in Iberian history, but in the history of the entire Western Mediterranean world. The battle did not end Muslim power in Iberia overnight. There were still 2.5 centuries of Reconquista to come, culminating with the fall of Granada in 1492, the same year, incidentally, that Columbus sailed westward and changed the world in a different way. But after 1212, the direction of travel in Iberia was settled. The momentum was with the Christian kingdoms, and it did not reverse. Ferdinand III of Castile, Alfonso VIII's grandson, conquered Córdoba in 1236, Murcia in 1243, Seville in 1248. James I of Aragon took Valencia in 1238. The Almohad Empire in Iberia was not conquered in one dramatic campaign. It was dismantled piece by piece over decades by a generation of rulers who had grown up knowing that Las Navas had made this possible. They inherited the legacy of that July morning and built empires on it. The long-term consequences extended even further. The unified Christian Spain that would eventually emerge from the Reconquista, the Spain of Isabella and Ferdinand, the Spain that funded Columbus, and the Spain that would colonize the Americas and shape the modern world, was built on the foundations laid at Las Navas de Tolosa. Not deterministically, not inevitably, but substantially. The battle created the conditions in which the Reconquista could be completed, in which the kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and eventually Navarre and Portugal could consolidate their power and eventually their territories. If Las Navas had gone differently, if al-Nasir's plan had worked, if Sancho's charge had been repulsed, if the Almohad defenses had held, the history of the Iberian Peninsula in the 13th century would have been radically different. Perhaps the Christian kingdoms would have survived in reduced form, clinging to the northern mountains. Perhaps the Almohad Empire would have extended its power north of the Pyrenees. Perhaps the cultural and political landscape of Europe, the France, the Spain, the Portugal we know, would be unrecognizable. We will never know what that world looks like, because a shepherd showed a king a path through the mountains, and a king from Navarre saw a gap in a chain and charged. There is also the cultural aftermath, the way this battle was remembered, celebrated, mythologized. Las Navas entered the collective memory of Spain as a foundational moment, an act of divine favor, the moment when God made clear who he was backing. This is, of course, the kind of retroactive certainty that only winners get to write, and it tells us more about how the victors chose to understand themselves than about anything supernatural. But it matters, because the way societies understand their own history shapes how they act in the future. In the Spain that emerged from the Reconquista carried Las Navas as a creation myth, a story about alliance, determination, faith, and the courage to charge when every instinct said wait. The chains of Navarre on the modern coat of arms, the feast days established to celebrate the victory, the chronicles, the poems, the paintings, an entire cultural edifice built on the memory of one July morning. And the physical battlefield itself, Las Navas de Tolosa, a village in the province of Jaén in modern Andalusia, still sits in the shadow of the Sierra Morena, quiet now, surrounded by olive groves and the same limestone ridges that watched armies maneuver in the summer heat of 1212. If you drive there today, park the car, and walk out onto the plateau in July, in the same heat, under the same sun, you can feel something. Not ghosts, not mysticism, just the weight of what happened in a place, the way certain landscapes carry their history in the texture of the air. 800 years, the chains on Navarre's coat of arms, Córdoba and Seville and Granada eventually, because of what happened here. The Spain that sailed to the Americas, the modern map of Europe. All of it, traceable in some meaningful way, to the moment when Sancho of Navarre saw a gap in an earthwork, made a decision, and charged. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about Las Navas de Tolosa. It is not a story about the superiority of one civilization over another. It is not a story that cleanly justifies the centuries of violence and displacement that the Reconquista brought with it. The communities uprooted, the cultural richness of Al-Andalus eventually erased, the human cost on both sides of a conflict that lasted 500 years. History is rarely that simple, and the most honest thing you can do with the past is resist the temptation to turn it into a morality play where the good guys win because they are good. What this is a story about is something more durable and more universal, It is a story about what happens when the weight of catastrophic defeat doesn't break a man. It educates him. Alfonso VIII spent 14 years after Alarcos, not just rebuilding his army, but rebuilding his understanding of what had gone wrong, what the Almohads were actually capable of, what kind of coalition would be necessary to face them, and what kind of leadership that coalition would require. He didn't waste his defeat. He studied it. He let it teach him. It is a story about the cost of arrogance, not the theatrical arrogance of chains and thrones and open Qurans, but the deeper arrogance of believing that your plan is infallible, that the outcome is already decided, that you don't need to adapt because God has already voted. Al-Nasir was not a fool. He was a capable, experienced commander who had done almost everything right. He built a strong position. He chose excellent terrain. He had numerical advantages and a proven defensive system. What he didn't account for was the possibility that his opponent would find a way around the part of the plan he had decided didn't need accounting for. Every strategist in every field, military, business, politics, sports, will recognize this failure. The plan that has no contingency. The assumption that because something is probable, it is inevitable. The moment when confidence crosses the invisible line into the assumption that the result is already in the bag. History is, at its core, a record of that line being crossed, and what happens to the people who cross it. And it is, finally, a story about the way a single human decision, Sancho of Navarre, looking at an earthwork, finding a weakness, making a choice, can change everything. Not because history is random, it isn't. Las Navas was the product of years of political work, military preparation, diplomatic effort, and strategic calculation. The conditions for a Christian victory existed, but conditions and victories are not the same thing. Conditions require someone to walk through the door. Sancho walked through the door, or more accurately, crashed through it at the head of a cavalry charge, and the world changed. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about the role of individual decisions in history? The idea that a single general's choice, a single king's charge, can bend the arc of centuries? Or do you think the structural conditions, the Almohad overextension, the Christian coalition, the logistical situation, made some kind of Christian victory at some point inevitable, regardless of what Sancho did on that particular morning? Drop it in the comments. I read them all. Seriously, some of the best historical analysis I've encountered has come from the people watching these videos, and I'd love to know what you think about this one. If this video made you think, made you feel something, made you see history a little differently, that's everything I'm trying to do here. Share it with someone who'd appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider this your sign. We do this every week. Deep, immersive, serious history, told the way it deserves to be told. The world is shaped by moments, by people who saw a gap and charged, by coalitions held together by purpose stronger than the rivalries that threatened to tear them apart, by the chains that became a coat of arms. 800 years later, we're still telling the story. That means something.